This episode of Tools for the Future is about the Waveline, a tool for designing more successful customer relationships and experiences. This is Ernest Toch. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1887, and he trained himself to write and perform music. In fact, he was a musical prodigy. He also studied medicine and wrote in his spare time. In 1909, he stunned the musical world by winning the Mozart Prize, which is given every 4 years to only one young composer. The idea that an untrained amateur could walk in to such a prestigious contest and win made him an instant sensation. During the 1920s, his works were celebrated and sought after by the world's foremost conductors and discerning concertgoers. In 1934, he fled to America and got a job at USC and started working for Hollywood. And he scored many films which were nominated for 3 Academy Awards, but his more serious composition career faltered. He's the originator of the term Waveline. In 1948, Toch published a book called The Shaping Forces in Music. It quickly became a classical instruction text for composers and is still in wide use today. Essentially, he began the concept of a waveline as an expression of musical narrative. In a real sense, this is a chart of narrative intensity over time, and it's a familiar pattern in many forms of narrative, not just music. This here is a classical waveline, meaning it's common and traditional, serving a lot of purposes, but by no means is it the only way to build a musical narrative or an experiential narrative, but it works well and it's comfortable for audiences. However, there are many possible shapes for this curve. We'll see how it applies to books and films and stories of all types. But as we learned in the Experiences Dimensions episode, any experience is really about relationships. You could also say that this represents a narrative of engagement and one of relationship. Now, building charts about customer journeys and customer relationships isn't exactly a new thing. However, the more common journey map charts a different kind of data than a waveline. In fact, the differences between the common journey map and the waveline typifies the different kinds of data that describe the experiences that customers or audiences has. Journey maps tend to be focused on touch points, mapping them over time, and only focusing on the touch points from the perspective of, let's say, the organization or the company that's designing a customer relationship. In essence, journey maps map function. In contrast, the waveline is really meant as a tool to design the entire relationship or experience. In fact, the line itself represents the change in state of mind for audiences or users or customers. The details that define the waveline include things like emotions, values, and meaning, and maps the kind of values that customers make decisions upon and assessments about within the entire customer experience. While both chart experience over time, wavelines put an emphasis on higher values like emotions, identity, and meaning, while also integrating the lower forms of value like price or functions. One nice thing about the waveline, as we'll see, is that it makes it much more clear where the best strategic points within the experience lie in terms of improving the overall experience. Here's a typical waveline for someone who's bought and tried to set up a high-end home theater system. As you can see, the expectations start off really high, but the moment they start reading the instructions or trying to assemble and trying to connect the devices, things turn south very quickly. There's different moments of hope and a few high points, but in general, the experience tends to keep going down, only blipping up every now and then as the user or customer struggles with setup and struggles with use. Very common in this experience is that even when the system is set up to work reasonably well, once a different family member comes in and tries to use it, often they throw the settings all off, or they don't know which of the 5 remotes to turn on in which sequence, and it sets the system into disarray. The thing to note here is that while many people have a negative experience with these kinds of technologies and products, no one in the companies that create them sets out to have this experience to be the one that happens. While the results of the design of their efforts is this experience, nobody set out for this to be the goal. Also note that if this were a customer journey map, the emphasis would be on functions and actions and touch points, and lost would be the impact of the emotions, in this case frustration and resentment, that typify and characterize the entire experience. This is because the touch points are only a piece of what's happening within our state of mind as we move through an experience. If we focus only on the touch points, the outward signals of the experience, we miss what's happening in customers and users and audiences' heads. What we learn from cognitive psychology is that state of mind is the sum of 5 different components of our attention. The first one is emotions. The second one is memories. The third one is mental models, or how we organize our understanding of the world. The fourth is perceptual bias, which is how we process sensory information different from each other. And the last one is behavioral responses. This is how we respond to the various stimuli that we encounter. Important to the design of experiences are these 2, mental models and behavioral responses. The rest are much more difficult to get at for a group or a large population because the memories may be so varied and specific, and there may be so many different kinds of perceptual biases. However, mental models and behavioral responses are things that we can research using design research techniques, organize, and conduct in terms of the design solutions that we create. It's important to note that all of these things live on a spectrum, from the most universal to the more personal. So whereas I don't know all the experiences you might have had as a child growing up and throughout your life, those are very personal memories, and I can't use those in any kind of organized design response. I can count on some memories being similar across generations or groups of people or niche markets. I can count on many emotions and mental models being consistent over some groups of people. Same thing with behavioral responses. So it's important to understand that while we can't design any specific experience for a specific person unless we know them really well, we can design for generalized populations, even quite large ones, if we understand their behavioral responses and their mental models well. So on this end of the spectrum, you would need to know people very well in order to design the successful experiences for them. Think of this as, for example, you designing a fantastic birthday party for your friend. What she or he is going to enjoy is going to be very different from other people that you might know, and certainly of strangers that you haven't met yet. However, on the other end of the spectrum, large groups of population, we can design understanding certain generalities that apply to everyone and still create successful experiences for them. Ask yourself, when does an experience or a relationship start? We can represent time in a timeline moving from left to right, which is common, at least in Western communities. But where we place the start point and where we imagine the end point is going to be really important for the relationships that we want to create. For a long time, e-commerce, for instance, was stuck on the idea that the e-commerce experience started when you went to a website and looked for something specific and ended when you ended up buying it. However, anyone in retail understands that there's a lot more to the experience. Most retail experiences start long before someone shows up in the store with the intent to buy something, and stretches longer than when they walk out of the store having purchased it. And if you want to create relationships, especially long-term relationships with customers, this is too truncated a time frame to be looking at. Even extending it out to walking into the store and walking out of the store is still too small of a time frame if you care about relationships. Perhaps the relationship could start when our customers or our audiences first perceive the need or the desire for something. And it might end not just when they bought it, but when they've used it and when it finally is used up and needs to be replaced, and perhaps they come back for another one. This is a much larger time frame that speaks to a much larger relationship should a company or organization desire to have long-term relationships and derive long-term value from customers. If we look at all the steps between these two, we start to describe a completely different timeline. Therefore, when we look into the details of this timeline, we see many, many more opportunities to intervene and create experiences and keep that relationship close to us and successful for a much longer time. Those companies just looking to make a sale and never have more of a relationship with customers just represent a small sliver of time within this timeline. Those customers that want long-term customer value, that want to build successful relationships over time, need to extend the time frame that they consider. As gruesome as it may be to talk about, ideally, your customer is your customer and keeps coming back for more until the day they die and cease to be a customer. But this is a very different kind of thinking than most business people, most engineers, even most designers and product developers think about when they design experiences, when they make products and services. This is a traditional Waveline from talk overlaid into a larger timeline called the hero's journey. This is a very common narrative structure that is known for creating a fairly successful, exciting, interesting story for audiences and users. We can use this as a template to build generic experiences that follow a similar narrative arc with excitement and interest. For example, imagine walking into a wonderful coffee shop. You arrive off the sidewalk, you walk in, you might notice the interior design, the aroma hits you, the signage directs you to the front desk and what the offerings are, the ordering is easy, the sounds and store details all contribute to the experience that you're having. Your coffee is prepared correctly and delivered to you. You finish and leave. Obviously, we've all had experiences where this has gone well and where this has gone poorly. But if we pay attention to the details, not just of the touch points, but the sensorial details and the emotional details that happen within this narrative, we can in fact build a better story of this experience that becomes the template for designing a better experience and delivering it. We can extend this out as far as our imaginations allow. Imagine a child going to a movie and seeing their first Disney movie, and then maybe later their parents take them to visit Disneyland, and they watch more movies as they grow up. They might go on a cruise. They see more movies and television, up to the point where they have children and they bring their own children into the same experiences with Disney that they had in their own childhood. You can imagine extending a Waveline of delight, of wonder, of excitement, of pleasure, all the way out over an entire lifetime that then feeds into and flows into other people and generations. Most customer journey maps don't allow you to do this kind of planning or this kind of analysis. In another example, imagine walking into a large office building downtown and you have a meeting on the 40th floor. In many beautiful buildings, the signage is so poor, the architecture is so difficult to navigate that the experience of arriving to the office that you're looking for becomes a big letdown. You may be awed by the beautiful materials and shapes of the soaring spaces within the lobby, but the moment you need to accomplish something, that awe turns into confusion and frustration. This is often the case with many buildings that are designed for appearances more than function. Compare two different kinds of conferences. Most tech conferences have a diminishing experience that peaks about the first or second day of the conference, especially if it's maybe a 5-day, a week-long conference. The best part of most vacations and conferences, in fact, is the anticipation that you have leading up to them. Once you're at the vacation or halfway through the vacation, once you're at the conference or just a few days in, often our experiences of these kinds of events goes down rapidly. Compare that, for instance, with the TED conference, which is set up with key differentiators that change the conference experience throughout, that keep it exciting, engaging, and delightful, which is to say, valuable. The design of every part of the TED conference is essentially a referendum on how most conferences, especially corporate conferences, are designed and implemented. They create completely different Wavelines because they've been designed in different ways, specifically with the understanding of what the state of mind of the conference goers are along the entire arc of the timeline. Now, one Waveline isn't necessarily better than a different kind of Waveline. Here's two different Wavelines for two very different games. You can see that one is much more episodic and periodic, moving up and down with periods of relaxation and high intensity. That's perfectly fine for a narrative game like World of Warcraft, whereas Grand Theft Auto quickly reaches a high intensity and never really lets down from it. One is more story-based, one is more adrenaline-based. But both are completely appropriate for the kinds of games that they are. So there's not one kind of Waveline that works for everyone or works for every case. Another example of this is compare these two different movies. One has a much more classic waveline, as Talk would imagined, and older movies tend to have this more gradual rise in intensity and suspense before the crescendo and the conclusion. However, a movie, in this case based on toys and games like Transformers, has a completely different, much more high-intensity waveline throughout the bulk of a movie. The intensity of Transformers doesn't mean it's better than Goldfinger, it's just different. Both can be successful and enjoyable films, they're just different kinds of films. Now, what's happening in the waveline is that there's actually about 4 different kinds of wavelines at any given moment. There's the expected waveline. This is what customers might expect to have happen when they enter a store, or they use a product, or they use a specific kind of service. Very often, our expectations are very low. Maybe they're too high, but they're very different than what we actually encounter. Over time, we may come to expect a very high experience in intensity and delight, and be let down because the actual experience didn't meet our expectations. Alternately, those of you who've ever walked into a phone store or a warehouse store may enter with very low expectations and leave with a much better experience than we expected. It's important for us to understand what the expectations of the experience throughout the timeline of our customers is. What our customers desire in their experience may be a very different waveline than what they expect to happen. And that's why this is a different representation. Often customers have low expectation, but they truly have high desires about what they could do in a particular experience. Contrasting to this is the current experience as it's designed, which may be high, which may be low, which may beat expectations or not, but it's still different from our customer desires and expectations. Lastly, and probably the most important waveline, is the one that we plan or design. This is the one that we determine to be the best possible waveline to meet both our customers or audiences or users' expectations and needs, as well as those goals of the organization. So there's many different wavelines possibly at work at any given time. However, in designing wavelines, once we've done our research, really there's only 2 critical wavelines that we need to pay attention to. That is the current waveline, which represents the current experiences our many customers and audiences have, and the planned or desired waveline. This is the one where we as developers imagine a new narrative that creates a much better experience for the majority of our customers. We may have several different wavelines for several different market segments, for instance. But when we overlay these 2 wavelines, the current experience and the desired or best planned experience, we can quickly see where the biggest gaps are. And strategically, that highlights our biggest opportunities to change the current experience into a much improved experience. This kind of diagram makes it very clear very quickly where companies or other kinds of organizations should direct their best efforts and priorities in creating a new kind of experience. When we create a new, best possible waveline, we need to start with emotions and meanings. We're planning literally a narrative that plays out over time of emotions, meanings, and state of mind for our customer. We may intentionally plan points where the state of mind or the intensity goes down to give them a break, in the same way that a film might misdirect people about events in order to set up a surprise or a delight later on. Notice that we're not placing touch points here. We're using the same skills that a screenwriter or a script writer or even a storyteller uses to plan out a better story of how our customers use our products and services, interact with our companies, or have some sort of experience that we're offering them. Once we design this narrative, that's when we come back in and place touch points that can trigger those emotions and meanings to happen. Notice that when we place the touch points second, we may quickly realize that the current touch points aren't capable of creating this narrative, this experience, and we may need entirely new touch points in order to make them happen. For instance, in the lead up to the waveline, we may need to look at how customers even find out about the experience before they enter it in order to create touch points that guide them into the experience. If we only looked at the experience itself as a truncated story, we'd never see those opportunities before they walk into a store or before they open an app or before they hit a website. Similarly, on the back end of the experience, if we never think about how they might use the device or tell a friend or upload a review or some other experience after they've made a purchase or after they've used our service, we miss the touch points that may need to be placed there in order to enable those kinds of behaviors and that kind of experience. Now, planning things over time isn't a new technique. There are many precedents for designing objects, services, events, and spaces over time. However, most of these haven't tracked all of the aspects of experience that we need to, nor all the types of value in order to make successful experiences. Note, for example, that architects routinely make models, whether they're virtual models and walkthroughs or physical models, of the buildings that they're creating or proposing. Yet very often, even with those models, the actual buildings fail to be successful for us in terms of delight and wonder and meeting our goals. So there are many different kinds of approaches that have been created over the years to describe the elements that make up better experiences and better relationships. These come from the tech world, they come from the movie world. This is one of my favorites, for instance, where filmmaker Alex McDowell creates something called an emotion graph for the movies that he makes. This one in particular is called Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, but he's worked on many, many other movies in his career. Here he's tracking color palettes throughout the entire length of the movie, emotional intensity, blending in the impact of the soundtrack, key visuals, timing, etc., all folded together in order to tell a cohesive story well. Never forget that what these lines represent isn't just a set of actions over time, but state of mind of our users, our customers, our audiences, our participants. It's always mostly about what's happening in their heads, not what their hands are doing. Instead of viewing this journey as a succession of touch points like events and services and products, we need to instead think of it as a flow or story that has emotion and meaning to us and that culminates into a meaningful, successful, and satisfying conclusion. Eventually, we build a picture of the current experience in terms of all forms of value compared to what we see as the ideal experience. We can chart different customer segments through this, but the upper and lower parts of the waveline are always bound by what our research has uncovered in terms of emotions, identity, meaning, and experience. When we place all of this on top of the same diagram, we can see more clearly the opportunities for our ideal experience, here shown in yellow at the top, against the current experiences for, in this case, 3 different market segments as they move through the experience as it's now designed. We can see the full range of experiences that all people researched have. That's the gray zone. And the colored market segment lines are the average or culmination of the people within those segments and the experiences that they have. We can dot this diagram with specific notes about touch points or channels or media, and we can clearly highlight where the best opportunities to intervene and create a better or even ideal experience so that everyone can see with the data in the diagram where the best opportunities are to improve the experience. We need to literally design the delivery of value or the relationship if we want to reap its rewards. Now, there's no set form for these wavelines to take. Your versions or approaches are going to be just as valid and innovative as anything that I've seen from clients or in the classroom. So don't let the form of the waveline inhibit you from exploring how best to communicate the insights you found from your research and the best opportunities for improving the customer experience. Ultimately, it's all about finding new opportunities. And however you choose to explain that visually will help you make your point to the various stakeholders and leadership that you need to communicate with. I've created templates within my website to help people organize these things, but starting with a blank piece of paper may be just as easy for you. The first step is to place the start and end points of the experience as you're going to define them. Remember, it's critical that you don't narrow the experience that you're looking at too much, because you'll miss opportunities on both ends. If it's too broad, it may be too easy to get lost and not focus, but if it's too narrow, you may miss key opportunities to intervene in your audience or customer's state of mind in order to shape a much better experience. The second step is to plot the current experience as your customer's experience. Of course, this is all supposed to come from research. Start with one customer segment, and you can eventually plot more. Where you've done the actual research, you use this to plot the distribution of different experiences, the gray, and you can also embed evidence here as well. This is probably a better way to segment your customers, in fact, and you may find that you need to redefine your segments from what they were defined previously as a result. For instance, rather than segmenting people by novices, intermediate users, and experts, you may find it much more powerful to organize your market segments and separate them by those looking to have a sense of accomplishment, those looking to have a sense of creativity, and those looking for a sense of wonder. How you define your market segments makes it easier or harder to have better relationships with them along those most important goals and meanings. I explain this a lot more in my book, A Whole New Strategy. Next, you can note and label touch points that trigger the current experience and create the waveline. Next, you can note and label the touch points, and these should include the touch points outside of your company's control as well as the ones inside your company's control if they have a material impact on your customer's waveline. Once you have the current experience waveline defined, now it's time to design a better experience using emotions and core meanings as the main narrative. Don't worry about the touch points necessary to enact this waveline at all. That's what opens up the process of design. The delta between the two highlight your best opportunities. This is where you should eventually focus your efforts for maximum success. Now, there are a lot of remaining details to understand about wavelines. One is that we need to ensure that the perspectives that we're using to create the wavelines is that of our audience and not merely our own organizations. That's why we want to look at this total narrative, not just from the perspective of the things that we currently produce. Events in the world, for instance, shape the waveline our customers are on without regard to how we had planned things to go. This is why the process needs to be evaluated in real time and given tweaks along the way in order to stay relevant in the world around us, regardless of when the last time we set company strategy, for instance. I describe a lot more about this in our book Blind Spot and its impact on strategy in A Whole New Strategy. Thank you.